Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Fletcher Grae, and I worked this coast long before the world fell apart. Fish paid my rent and kept fuel in the tank. Storm charts and tide tables were my calendar. Most days started in the pitch dark with a thermos in one hand and a coil of wet rope in the other, and ended with salt drying on my face and the smell of diesel soaked into my clothes. The harbor I called home was small, the kind of place where everyone knew who owned which boat and who owed who a case of beer. I wasn't special there, just another guy with a weathered skiff, a half-decent engine, and enough knowledge of the shoals to avoid tearing the hull open on a bad tide. What I did have was patience and a habit of noticing the things other people ignored. One of those things was the old oil rig that sat miles off our coast. It was a small platform, not one of those massive cities on stilts you see in documentaries. It was just 4 legs in the water, a square deck on top, a cluster of rusted towers and pipes, and a flat pad where a helicopter used to land. No lights at night, no crew, no radio calls. Officially, it was decommissioned. Unofficially, it was forgotten. Most boats gave it a wide berth. Charts marked it as an obstruction, and captains treated it like a rock with bad manners. I treated it like a landmark and sometimes like a secret. On foggy days, I would swing close just far enough to see the jagged shape through the gray, and think about the fact that there was dry steel and empty rooms sitting out there over deep water. Back then, it was just an odd detail in my mental map. Later, it would be the only place that made sense. When the sickness first hit the news, our harbor was already settling into the gray teeth of late autumn. Mornings came dark and biting, with ice glazing the ropes and heavy fog rolling over the water. Down on the pier, nobody changed a damn thing. Boats still left before dawn, their diesels chugging in the quiet, and the bait shack still opened right on time. People shook their heads at the TV screens and said it would blow over. We had seen health scares before. Each time it followed the same tired path: noise, worry, a few rough weeks of headlines, and then life settled back into the groove. As long as the fish still ran and the sea looked normal, the idea that our small, rusty harbor could be at the center of anything serious felt ridiculous. My first real sign that this time was different came in on a trawler. I was coiling lines on the south dock when she entered the channel. Her bowswing was sloppy, and she was listing hard to port like the load had shifted badly in the hold. Instead of easing into her slip with the usual care, she slammed the pilings hard enough that the dock boards shook under my boots. The captain came over the handheld radio, his voice slow and slurred, asking for help docking in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Harbor patrol went out and climbed aboard. The crew that came off that boat looked hollowed out. One man had a bandage on his arm wrapped so tight his hand was pale wax. Another stared past everyone, tracking something only he could see. Nobody joked about a rough trip or blamed the weather. They went straight from the ramp to the waiting ambulance, which rolled away with its lights flashing but no siren, leaving a heavy silence behind it. Rumors moved faster than any official report. Someone at the fuel dock claimed it had been a fight over shares. Someone else at the bait shop said the fight involved teeth, not just fists. The word felt stupid in my head, something out of a bad movie, until more ambulances started using our access road, their tires screaming on the asphalt. I heard sirens all day. Our local hospital was small, barely enough for a bad flu season, so when the beds filled up, the county turned the ferry terminal into a spillover ward and screening point. It was a disaster waiting to happen. A big building, lots of chairs, working bathrooms, but zero containment. They set up rows of cots between the ticket counters and the vending machines and built a path with flimsy tape where people with ferry tickets and people with raging fevers all moved through the same hall. From the harbor office, we watched it unfold on the security cameras. At first, it looked like any busy travel day, just tense. Lines shifted and someone argued at the desk about a schedule. Then the movement changed shape. A tight cluster formed near the middle of the hall, violent and sudden. People on the edges started stepping back instead of craning their necks to see. One figure went down hard, another bent to help and disappeared into the knot of bodies. Security pushed in and the crowd just swallowed them from view. The main glass doors shook in their frames. Staff tried to lock them from the inside, fumbling with keys. Folks outside, hearing screams they couldn't understand, pulled on the handles. Pressure built from both sides on the same pane of glass. When one panel finally shattered, bodies pushed through in both directions like water bursting a dam. On the grainy screen, it looked like a pile of heavy coats sliding over tile. Some stayed down and did not move. Some hit the floor, twitched, and then began to get back up when they had no business moving at all. Our harbor chief watched long enough to see one man stand up with his arm hanging loose at a sickening angle, and his head tilted wrong, still moving toward the nearest living person with zero hesitation. The chief turned off the monitor and said the terminal was lost. His new order was to close the piers, stop anyone coming from that building, and hold the line at the main gate. Strong words, thin tools. We had one service rifle, a stack of plastic cones and sawhorses, and a chain-link fence between us and whatever hell was spilling down that road. The first wave reached us near dusk. Some people ran in a blind, terrified sprint. Others walked in a slow, shuffling drag that looked painful. A woman hit the fence first, wrapping her fingers in the mesh, screaming at us to open up. A man behind her slammed into the same spot and kept pushing, his face slack even when she yelled at him to stop. Our guard, a guy named Reese, shouted for them to back away. The woman heard him and stepped off the fence, eyes wide. The man did not. Fingers locked into the wire, he started to climb. Reese fired a warning shot over his head. The man didn't even flinch. The next shot hit him square in the chest. He dropped, lay still for a few seconds, then began to roll and reach forward, dragging himself by his hands, his legs useless but his intent clear. In the office behind us, panic turned into frantic planning. Some wanted to run uphill to the old Coast Guard station, counting on stone walls and high ground. Others wanted to cram whoever they could onto the remaining boats and run for open water. Each idea depended on clean crews, safe landings, and roads that weren't already burning or gridlocked. While they circled the same arguments, voices rising, my eyes drifted to one camera on the far edge of the monitor wall. It showed the water outside the harbor mouth and on the horizon the jagged outline of the old oil rig. No parking lot, no glass front, no lines of strangers. Just 4 steel legs and a rusted deck over deep water. The thought was simple and it wouldn't leave. Crowds and hallways were death now. A high, empty platform with only a few ways up might still be life. That rig had its own generators and tanks once. Staying here meant trusting a chain-link fence and a man with shaking hands holding a rifle. Leaving meant trusting a small boat and a forgotten square of steel. For the first time that day, the choice in front of me felt crystal clear. I didn't broadcast my exit. One more opinion would only slow me down, and the crowd at the terminal was already pushing dangerously close to our perimeter. While the chief and the others argued over maps and flickering camera feeds, I pulled a work order pad from the desk and used the back of a sheet for a quick list. Storage sat 3 doors down from the office. I walked there at a measured, boring pace so nobody felt invited to stop me. Inside, I grabbed a heavy canvas duffel, hit the shelves, and kept it tactical. Bottled water went in first, heavy but necessary, then some dry food and a few sealed emergency rations. I added a trauma kit, duct tape, heavy-duty trash bags, insulated work gloves, a coil of nylon rope, and a handful of specific tools, a pry bar, bolt cutters, and a heavy wrench. I stopped when the duffel felt heavy enough to be a burden but light enough to swing one-handed if I had to run. The radio room came next. I signed out a rugged handheld set and 2 spare battery packs, scribbling my initials like this was just another Tuesday shift. Under the desk, I found a small folding solar panel still in its plastic wrap. I had tested one like it at home and knew it could trickle charge a radio if the sun held, so that went into the bag too. The corridor leading to the docks was unnervingly quiet. Most of the staff had moved upstairs, putting distance between themselves and the glass front of the building. One guard stayed by the steel door to the ramps. His name was Reese, an old-timer who had been working nights since before I was hired. He saw the bag, looked at my face, and knew damn well this wasn't about fixing channel markers. He asked if I was heading out, his hand resting near his belt, and I told him I was checking the outer buoys and the channel cut so the panic evacuation didn't smash hulls on the rocks in the dark. He didn't buy it, but he didn't stop it. He glanced at the monitor on the wall. The terminal feed showed plywood flexing in its frame under the weight of the crowd. The marina feed showed too many hands fighting over too few lines. One camera pointed past the harbor mouth, where the oil rig was just a smudge of dark ink against the gray water. He looked at my radio and said he wanted it kept on if there was anything out there worth hearing. I nodded and said, "I'll keep it on, Reese." He could have called the chief. He could have stopped me from taking a county boat without orders. Instead, he hit the door release. The magnetic lock clicked, and cold air pushed in, carrying the smell of diesel, salt spray, and something sour drifting down from the terminal. Our response boat sat tied along the outer slips, bobbing in the chop. I passed the newer unit with its clean paint and digital radar and went straight to the oldest rigid inflatable in the row. She was ugly, patched, and scarred, but I had done the maintenance on her for years. I knew every bad sound she could make, and more importantly, I knew she had a mechanical diesel engine that didn't rely on fancy electronics. I also knew where the spare key sat taped under the console. The duffel went into the stern. I cast off the bow and stern lines, stepped on board, and kept low as I moved to the helm. My hands settled as soon as I turned the key. The engine coughed once, caught on the second try, and fell into a rough, throaty idle I trusted more than any person on that dock. I eased the throttle forward just enough to engage the prop and kept the wake small so I didn't slam the neighbors' hulls. Faces watched from behind marina windows. People stood on the decks of pleasure boats they didn't know how to run, shouting and fumbling with lines, looking frantically from the burning terminal to the locked gate and back again. Nobody called my name, and I kept my eyes strictly on the fairway. Inside the breakwater, the water was chopped up by tight turns and other people's bad decisions. Outside, the swell stretched into long, heavy Atlantic rolls. As soon as I cleared the rocks, the bow lifted, dropped, and lifted again, spray hitting the windscreen. The town pulled away behind me, reducing itself to a smear of amber lights and thin smoke against the hills. The ferry sat crooked at its pier, and the road in front of the terminal had already become a stagnant line of stopped vehicle headlights. The rig sat farther out than it ever felt when I was just glancing at it between setting nets. From a distance, it was nothing but a low, dark block on four legs with a few taller shapes reaching into the clouds. No lights, no rotation on the radar arrays, no sound but the wind and the water slapping the hull. It looked dead, which was exactly what I needed. As I got closer, the scale of the thing started to hit me. The legs were massive steel columns, thick as redwoods and streaked with rust. The water twisted around them where the current and the swell met, creating confused, choppy waves that slapped against the metal. I cut the throttle and let the boat drift for a second while I picked my line. The main deck spread somewhere way above my head, a dark ceiling hidden by the underside of the structure and the cross bracing. On the southeast leg, a narrow steel stair climbed from a small graded landing just above the waterline up to the deck in a steep zigzag. A thin service ladder dropped from that lower landing almost to the surface of the swells. No fresh ropes hung there. No other boats were tied off. It was just chipped metal, barnacles, and gull droppings. I nudged the bow toward the ladder, timing the throttle with the heave of the ocean. The hull tapped the nearest leg with a hollow, booming knock that sounded too loud out here. I grabbed the ladder with one hand, dropped the engine to neutral, and quickly looped the bowline over a rusted cleat welded at the base of the column. The knot didn't have to be pretty, it just had to hold. This was my only way off if things went south. The ladder felt slick under my gloves. Years of freezing spray and zero maintenance had left a skin of salt and slime on the rungs. I waited for the boat to rise on a swell, then stepped off and hauled myself up. The wind hit harder as soon as my shoulders cleared the level of the main deck. I paused on the first landing, looking up. Above me, I saw the rusted arm of an old lifeboat davit. Empty now. but the winch mechanism looked like it might still have gears. I filed that away for later. When I looked back down, the boat looked like a toy bobbing on a gray sheet. The harbor was just a small cut in the coastline, already losing detail in the gloom. Above me, the platform waited. If it was empty, there was a chance to turn it into a fortress. If it wasn't, I was about to find out the hard way, with nowhere to run but down a slippery set of stairs into freezing water. I adjusted the duffel on my shoulder, gripped the cold rail, and started the climb. At the top of the stairs, the platform opened into a narrow strip of galvanized grating running along the edge of the main deck. Rusted railings circled the outside, vibrating slightly as the wind pushed through them, carrying only the hollow boom of waves hitting the legs far below. I stepped away from the edge and walked a tight loop to make sure I was truly alone. The deck held plenty of old industrial clutter, spools of wire, empty pallets, but nothing fresh. 2 small shipping containers stood near the center with their padlocks fused into lumps of rust. A set of steel stairs climbed to a raised block of rooms that held the control gear and crew quarters. I looked for the small signs, no fresh footprints in the grime, no candy wrappers, no recent trash tucked into corners. Whoever had shut this place down years ago had not come back, and nobody else had claimed it since. Near the middle of the deck, I found the main door into the superstructure. The paint had peeled off in long gray strips, exposing the steel beneath. The handle felt rough under my glove, but it turned with a heavy clunk. The door opened on stiff hinges that screamed against the salt air. Inside, a short hallway ran inward with rooms on both sides. I stepped through, heaved the door closed, and the wind instantly dropped to a dull, muffled drone outside the walls. The air inside smelled stagnant, a mix of old metal, dust, and trapped cold. I kept the radio on my belt and a heavy flashlight in my hand while I cleared each room. Offices came first. Bolted down desks, overturned chairs, dead monitors with cracked screens, and filing cabinets stuck half open, holding piles of paper with curled edges that nobody had touched in a decade. The galley was the same story. A long table bolted to the floor, bare benches, empty cabinets, and an open industrial fridge with nothing inside but mold. No food, no clean water, nothing worth staying for. I shut it all and moved on. The bunk rooms were better. Metal frames sat in 2 tiers along the walls. Most mattresses were stripped bare, but in the 3rd room I found a footlocker under a lower bunk. The padlock has been cut long ago. Inside sat a rolled sleeping bag in a compression sack and a pair of thick wool socks. I took both. Out here, warm sleep and dry feet were worth more than any file or computer screen. 1 level up, the control room wrapped around the front of the structure. Slanted windows looked out over the deck and the restless water. Behind that space, a heavy metal door opened into the generator room. 2 big diesel units sat on a grated floor, silent and cold. I checked the main fuel tank with my light and a dipstick I found on the wall. Diesel still sat in the bottom, sludge-heavy and old but flammable. It wasn't full, but it wasn't dry. If the engines turned and the lines weren't clogged with algae, I had a way to make power in short bursts. I noted it but didn't touch the starter. Noise was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. Back on the main level, I walked the path from the sea to the hall. Right now, the security was a joke. It took 1 ladder, 1 open stretch of deck, 1 stair, and 1 door to reach where I planned to sleep. That was fine for a regular crew, but bad for 1 person who might have to deal with desperate strangers. The ladder from the water was the first weak point. I didn't want any boat to pull up and send people climbing straight to my living room. I went back down to the landing, pulled the duffel from the skiff, and went looking for the hardware I'd spotted on the way up. Near the corner of the deck, the old lifeboat station stood empty, but the manual winch was still bolted to the frame. It took me 20 minutes of sweating and cursing with a breaker bar to strip the winch loose, and another 10 to drag the heavy mechanism over to the stairs. The service ladder was welded at the top, but the bottom 20 feet were bolted on a maintenance flange. With the heavy wrench from my bag, I fought the lower bolts. The rust fought back, but eventually they shrieked and gave way. The bottom section swung free, held only by a pivot. I ran a length of chain through the rungs, connected it to my scavenged winch, and cranked it tight. Slowly, the bottom section of the ladder rose up until it sat horizontal, high above the water. From the sea, the ladder now stopped 20 feet in the air, useless to anyone without wings. From the deck, I could lower it if I chose. Then I went back inside and looked at the doors. The main door had a lock, but locks never stopped anyone with a crowbar. I checked the hinges, then dragged a heavy steel filing cabinet across the hall and jammed it against the inside of the door. Anyone trying to shove through would have to move 300 pounds of dead weight first, and that would be loud enough to wake the dead. 3 other doors opened from the hall to the deck. I didn't need 4 ways in. I picked the one closest to the stairs as my main route and killed the others. A rack of spare pipe and some old steel cable did the rest. I laid 2 pipes across each unused door frame and lashed them in place with intricate knots that would tighten if pulled. From the outside, those doors now met a wall of steel instead of open air. By the time I finished, the light through the small portholes had gone flat and dim. My hands ached and the cold was seeping through my jacket. I chose a bunk room near the middle of the structure, away from outer walls to hide any light. I shook the dust off one mattress and rolled my new sleeping bag out. The rig wasn't a fortress yet. It was a hollow shell on 4 legs with enough height to give me a warning if trouble came. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the ocean hit the steel legs, I knew it would do for one night. In the morning, I would start turning it into something I could actually hold. The first night on the rig felt longer than any double shift I had ever worked. Outside, the wind hit the walls in steady rhythmic bursts and the steel frame ticked and groaned as it cooled in the dark. Thermal contraction that sounded too much like footsteps. None of it necessarily meant trouble, but my body treated every metallic pop like a hand trying a door handle. My boots stayed on, my jacket stayed zipped to the chin, and the duffel sat within reach at the foot of the bunk. The radio rested on a crate next to my head. I kept the volume low, the channels thick with the noise of a world coming apart. It was a mess of voices, people shouting over each other on open frequencies, police dispatchers begging for backup that wasn't coming. Someone near the harbor mouth screaming about a fire on the breakwater. Then one by one, the voices dropped out. One vanished mid-sentence, another cut to static. After a while, a flat looped recording took over, telling everyone to stay indoors, lock their doors, and wait for instructions that we all knew weren't coming. Sleep came in short, jagged pieces, but each time I jerked awake, the same gray bulkhead sat in front of me. That cold metal wall was the only thing keeping me from running back to the skiff and straight into the nightmare I had just escaped. Morning came gray and biting cold. The metal under my hand felt like ice, and my breath smoked in the air even inside the bunk room. The hallway outside my door was empty. No voices, no frantic steps, just the whistle of the wind and the dull, heavy thump of waves hitting the legs down below. As far as I could tell, the rig was still mine. The first job was to assess the asset in daylight. Outside, the deck showed more detail than it had the night before. Rust streaking down from every bolthead, old industrial cables coiled in corners like dead snakes, a stack of weathered pallets near one container, and a row of empty 55-gallon drums lashed to the rail. With better light and a heavy pry bar, I finally snapped the lock on one of the containers. Inside, I found hoses, lengths of PVC pipe, and bins of worn gloves and hard hats. Nothing you could eat or drink, but it was raw material. The pallets would burn if I could build a safe stove. The drums could hold rain. The pipe and cable would make decent barriers. I went back to the hall, tore the back off an old safety poster, and wrote 4 words on the clean cardboard. Water. Heat. Light. Access. Water came first. I followed the plumbing along the ceilings until the pipes ended in a mechanical room with 2 upright tanks and a dead control panel. The gauges sat at 0. A sharp knock on the steel rang hollow. They were dry. Whatever this place had stored for its crew had been drained or evaporated years ago. Rain would have to cover the gap. Late autumn on this coast usually meant more water than anyone wanted. I rinsed 2 of the cleaner drums with a precious cup of my bottled water and rolled them under the edge of the helipad where runoff already dripped in a steady line. I used a tarp and some paracord to rig a funnel that turned that trickle into a directed sheet. The next storm would tell me if my plumbing worked. Heat was the harder problem. My fingers already ached and I was working in gloves. A walk through the rooms turned up one decent option, a heavy-duty wall heater in the control room. But that ran on electricity, which meant testing the heart of the beast. In the generator room, I checked the oil levels and belts on the massive diesels. I bled a little air from a fuel line and hit the start button on the smaller auxiliary unit. The diesel coughed, shuddered, and then settled into a rough, loud idle. Lights flickered on in the hall, buzzing with energy. I checked the fuel gauge. It sat around a quarter tank. I looked at the heater in the control room, then back at the massive engine roaring next to me. The math didn't work. Burning gallons of diesel just to run a standard electric heater was a waste that would kill me later. I let the engine run for 5 minutes to charge the radio batteries and ensure the system worked. Then I killed it. The silence rushed back in, heavy and cold. I would have to survive the temperature until I could build something that burned wood or trash. On the deck, I started organizing. Any spare lumber, broken crate, or stray board went into a dry pile inside the container. Nearby, I stacked the drums, tarps, rope, and cable. Seeing those piles made the place feel less like a dead platform and more like a project. This wasn't about surviving forever in one move. It was about getting through the next stretch of freezing weather and buying time for better ideas. Toward evening, a storm rolled in from the west, just as the sky promised. The wind pushed the swell higher until water slammed the legs hard enough that the vibrations traveled up through the floor and into my boots. Rain hit the deck in horizontal sheets. Loose metal rattled on every level. I stayed inside, walked the halls, and checked each blocked door to make sure the barricades hadn't shifted under the vibration. By nightfall, the storm had settled into a steady, deafening roar. Outside, the drums under the helipad rang like bells as the runoff hit them, a beautiful sound. I ate a cold ration in the bunk room with my back against the wall and my feet on the duffel, listening to the rig ride out the hits. The radio hissed between broken bits of talk from shore, most of it panic, most of it dying out. I turned it off and listened to the storm, knowing the harbor was gone for me and that whatever future I had now sat on 4 rusted legs above deep, angry water. Days settled into a grinding gray pattern. Each morning I walked the deck, checking the tension on the winch cable holding the ladder and the mooring lines of my skiff. Then I fished off the lee side before looking in on the water drums under the helipad. Food stocks dropped faster than the temperature. I cut my meals down to 1 ration pack a day and tried to stretch the rest with whatever came up on the handline. Some days I ate fresh rockfish or sea bass. Other days I watched the red float bob for hours and pulled up nothing but empty hooks and seaweed. On the worst days, when the hunger gnawed hard enough to make my hands shake, I set snares for the gulls that roosted on the upper towers. The meat was stringy and tasted like oily garbage, but it was protein, and out here taste was a memory I couldn't afford. The radio traffic thinned out too. Calls from nearby towns went from frantic screams to broken pleas and finally to a static silence that felt heavier than the wind. The cold moved in like a physical weight. Ice formed on the railings each night and stayed there well after sunrise, making the steel treacherous. Each time I stood by the fuel tank and thought about taking the last of the diesel to make a run for open water. I pictured the crowded docks I'd left behind and hands clawing at any boat still tied up. The idea always died before it reached my feet. One slate gray afternoon, I went down to the lower landing to grease the gears on the manual winch. If that mechanism seized and the ladder wouldn't lower, I was trapped. If it failed and the ladder dropped, I was exposed. While I worked the wrench on a stubborn bolt, a shape on the water pulled my eye. At first, it looked like just another dark knot of kelp between the waves. Then it rose on a swell and came into sharp focus. A small, open boat, fiberglass hull, sitting dangerously low in the water. 1 outboard motor, 3 people aboard. The motor pushed, coughed blue smoke, then caught again. Their course was shaky, but it led straight toward the legs of my rig. I set the wrench down, wiped the grease from my hands, and picked up the rifle I kept leaned against the strut. When they closed the distance to 50 yards, I saw one man at the tiller, a woman in the bow, and a younger guy in the middle hugging a waterproof pack like it was a child. Their clothes were soaked dark and spotted with salt. None of them looked strong enough to be a real boarding party. They looked like barely warmed over death. But desperate people with nothing to lose are the most dangerous kind. They saw me about the same time I decided to be seen. I stepped forward to the edge of the grating where they couldn't miss the silhouette of the rifle, raised my free hand and called down, "Kill the engine! Hands where I can see them, don't drift any closer to the pylons." The man at the motor flinched, grabbed the tiller for balance as a wave hit them, then lifted both hands and yelled back, All right, easy. We're running on fumes anyway, just don't shoot us." And up close, the distance didn't help their look. The woman in the bow had a knit cap pulled low and a heavy coat that was soaked through. The younger one in the middle hugged his pack tighter when he saw the gun barrel. I kept the rifle steady, aimed at the waterline of their boat, and said, "Push back a bit. I want to see the whole boat, inside and out." The man at the motor nudged the throttle one last time and the bow swung, giving me a view of the floorboards, and he said, "That's it. No one hiding. Just the three of us and a hell of a bad week." They drifted again in the lee of the leg, sheltered from the worst of the wind but staring up at a ladder that ended 20 feet above their heads. I let a few seconds pass to let them feel the height, then said, "Give me your names and the last place you stood on dry land." The woman straightened as much as the chop let her, wiped spray from her eyes, and answered, "April Rook," then pointed her chin back at the motor and said, "That's Mac," and then toward the kid and added, "And this is Finn. We came up from the South Harbor. The dock went bad 2 days ago. We've been bailing water ever since." I kept my voice flat, letting the wind carry it down. "How long since any of you were bitten, scratched, or covered in blood that wasn't yours?" Max shifted on the bench, keeping his hands carefully visible, and said, "We know the drill, man. If we were bit, we wouldn't be trying to climb a tower. We'd be swimming, no bites, no scratches." Finn pushed his wet sleeves up, showing pale, goose-bumped skin, and said, "Nothing fresh. We stayed clear of anyone that moved wrong. We're just freezing." They had the right answers, but anyone could memorize a script to save their life. I nodded once and said, "This place is not a ferry station, and I'm not opening my door to the first boat that drifts by. If I lower this ladder and you're lying I die in my sleep, I'm not taking that bet easily." April looked up at the deck, then back at me, her face hard, and said, "I get it. You don't know us. You shouldn't trust us, but if you send us back out, the fuel hits 0 in an hour and the hypothermia finishes what the dock started. We're not asking for a free ride. We can work. We have tools." The wind pushed under their bow and the boat rocked violently. Finn reached for the gunwale, caught himself, and let go again so his hands stayed visible, eyes locked on me. Mac watched my rifle, then the raised ladder, and I could see he was doing the math on how long they lasted if I said no. 3 more people meant less food, more waste, and more risk. It also meant more hands to tie rope, lift steel, and watch the horizons when the weather turned worse. I weighed the idea of telling them to turn away, to drift south and die on someone else's watch. And I felt the wrong kind of quiet settle in my chest. That was a line I wasn't ready to cross yet. I drew a deep breath of cold air, shifted the rifle so the barrel pointed at the water instead of their chests, and said, "All right, we do this one way. Gear comes up first on a rope, then I lower the ladder and you climb one at a time. You stop on the landing so I can look you over before you step 1 foot on my deck. You follow every word I say or I cut the line. Clear enough?" April let out a breath that fogged the air, nodded hard, and said, "Clear. Just don't change your mind halfway up." I told them to kill the engine completely and throw me a line. While Mac wrapped a cord and tossed it up to the grating, Finn finally spoke in more than a few words, his voice cracking with cold, and said, If you still send us away after this, at least we tried something that made sense. That tired, simple truth stayed with me as I tied their rope off, walked to the winch, and began to crank the heavy handle to lower the bridge between my world and theirs. Mac tied the loose end of their line to the bow cleat, and I pulled hand over hand until a heavy, water-soaked duffel scraped its way up the side of the hull. I swung it onto the landing, checked the zippers for traps, and hauled it up to the deck. 2 more bags came up the same way. When their gear sat in a dripping pile by my boots, I set the rifle within reach, lowered the ladder with the winch just enough for them to reach it, and told them they could start climbing. April went first. She moved slow but solid, placing 1 boot deliberately on each rusted rung. On the landing, she stopped where I told her and turned so I could see her hands and face under the gray light. I pointed at her sleeves and said, "Roll them up past the elbow." She pushed the wet fabric up, showed clean goose-bumped skin, then lifted her collar so I could see her neck. I checked for any hard shape that didn't look like clothing, found nothing. Nodded toward the heavy steel door and said, "Straight inside to the hall. Don't touch anything, just wait there." Mac climbed next with the easy swinging balance of someone who had spent a life on scaffolding. On the landing, he held still while I checked his arms, neck, and ribs where his jacket rode up. A heavy pipe wrench hung from a loop on his belt. I pointed at it with the barrel of the rifle and said, "That stays in the loop. If your hand touches it, we have a problem." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, shook his head and said, "If this goes bad, friend, that's not the tool that saves us." Then he stepped onto the deck and followed April. Finn came last. Up close, he looked even younger than I had guessed, maybe late teens, with deep, dark circles carved under his eyes. On the landing, he showed his hands and arms without being asked and tipped his head so I could see his neck. I looked him in the eye and said, "Any bite? Any deep scratch? Any blood on you that isn't yours?" He swallowed hard once and answered, "No." We ran before it got close and stayed clear of crowds. I haven't touched a sick person in a week. I watched his face while he spoke and saw no flicker of a lie, just exhaustion. Once all 3 stood in the hallway, I closed the heavy outer door, shoved the filing cabinet back into place to bar it, and let the wind drop to a dull rumble outside the walls. The 4 of us faced each other in the narrow, dim space, and I said, "This rig is the only reason I'm still breathing. If you stay, you follow the rules. No hiding injuries. No opening doors without talking to someone first. No trips down to the water alone. If that works, you get bunks and a say in what we do. If it doesn't, you go back down the ladder while there's still light." April glanced toward the bunk rooms, then back at me, assessing the space with a professional eye, and said, "I ran water and waste systems on a passenger ferry before the world broke. Tanks, toilets, cleaning stock. If you want this place livable without disease killing us, I know how to make the pipes behave." Mac hooked a thumb at his chest and said, "I did rig work and small engine repair, pumps, winches, generators. If it turns, burns fuel, or needs wiring, I've worked on it." Finn shifted his pack on his shoulder, looking small in the hallway, and said, "Paramedic. Cuts, breaks, fevers. I know how to keep people standing in bad conditions when there's no doctor coming." That was enough for me. I nodded once and said, "Then you stay. We sleep in the same block of rooms, eat at the same table, and walk the rig together until you know every ladder and bolt. No solo hero moves. If someone gets bit or sick, they say it the second it happens." Nobody argued. I led them to the bunk room I had claimed, showed them the other empty frames, and said they could take bunks and drop their packs, but to put anything sharp or loud in one pile so we could sort it later. Then we did one slow, methodical lap of the rig. I pointed out the chained ladder, the blocked doors, the silent generator room, the dry water tanks, the drums catching rain under the helipad, and the piles of scrap and pallets I had started scavenging. April watched pipes and drains like they were gold. Mac touched bolts and brackets, checking for corrosion. Finn's eyes tracked rails and corners, mapping exits and drops without a word. Back in the galley, we sat with cups of precious water and a small share of food and turned that walk into a plan. I pulled an old maintenance sheet off a corkboard, flipped it over, and wrote 6 words across the top. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. April tapped water and waste with a dirty fingernail and said, "I'll take these." We pick one bathroom near the bunks and make it our hygiene block. 1 toilet, 1 sink, 1 corner for washing. But we don't flush with fresh water, that's for drinking only. We rig a bucket and line to the sea and we flush with salt water. I'll seal every other open drain that drops straight to the sea so rats don't climb up, and we hang soap where nobody can miss it. Mac pointed at power and access and said, "I want those. We can't run diesel every day just for lights. We save the big generators for tools and absolute emergencies. On the roof I saw some exhaust vents. I can strip an old fan motor, bolt it to a frame, and let the wind spin it to trickle charge a battery bank. For access, we cut the options. 1 main way in, 1 emergency route just for us, everything else gets a bar or a wall of drums." Finn looked at heat and food and said, "I don't care what you burn as long as it vents outside and doesn't gas us in our sleep. You give me soap, boiled water, and 1 clean corner and I'll keep infections small." Heat and food landed on me by default. I circled them and said, "We burn the pallets first, then we start stripping the offices for furniture and paper. After storms, we check the legs for driftwood caught in the cross bracing. We build a barrel stove in a room next to the bunks and run a chimney pipe out through a heavy plate. We fish off the lee side every day and treat every can of rations like it belongs to all of us." Then we stood up and went to work. April headed for the pipe room to start sealing drains. Mac went to the roof to salvage a fan. Finn cleared a table and built a clean medical corner in the galley. I went back to the doors and stacked more steel behind the weak spots. By the time the lights started to go, the rig felt less like an empty shell and more like a fortress we could actually hold. We didn't waste a second of the next morning. The cold was pushing harder each day, sneaking through the steel plating, and the rig wasn't going to forgive anyone who dragged their feet. We picked 1 level in the middle of the structure as our core and treated the rest like a sacrificial shell. Bunks, the barrel stove, the communal table, and the bathroom all sat on that level. Every other door and hallway either fed into it through a checkpoint or got permanently blocked. April took the bathroom closest to the bunks, treating it like a tactical objective. She checked the trap, traced the drain with a flashlight, and said, "This line joins the main waste tank, not open water, which keeps the rats out. But we don't flush with the tank water, that's for drinking." She tapped the porcelain frame with a wrench and added, "From now on, we use a bucket and a rope. You haul up seawater, you flush with that. 1 sink for hands and faces, rationed with a spray bottle. You wash here, you dry here, you clean up after yourself. Hygiene kills us faster than hunger if we lose it." Mac helped her drag an old locker in front of the other bathroom door, and Finn jammed a broken bunk frame between the locker and the opposite wall until the handle disappeared behind a wedge of metal and wood. Mac went hunting for parts to solve our power problem. On the roof above the control room, he found an industrial exhaust fan that still spun freely when he kicked it. He wrestled it down, stripped the casing on the galley table, and bolted the heavy motor to a short, improvised frame. From scrap sheet metal, he cut a simple tail fin so the wind would keep it pointed into the weather. I watched him work the connections and asked, "You sure that's worth the effort?" He tightened 1 last nut, spun the blades with his hand, and said, "Wind's the only thing up here that doesn't run out. This won't run a heater, but it'll keep the LED lanterns and the radio alive. It's better than killing the big generators and signaling every boat for 10 miles just to charge a battery." We mounted his small turbine on a stub mast near the top deck, set well back from the edge so it didn't shout our position to anyone passing close. Wires ran down through old conduit to a bank of 2 marine batteries he had pulled from dead gear and coaxed back into service. That night, the blades turned in the stiff breeze. A low, steady hum came through the roof, and for the first time since I arrived, we had power that didn't cost us a drop of diesel. My job stayed focused on heat and food. The pallets on deck were dry inside, even if the outer boards felt damp, but they wouldn't last the winter. I broke them down with a pry bar and saw for immediate fuel, but I also rigged a grappling hook from bent rebar. I spent hours leaning over the rail, hauling up heavy tangles of driftwood that had gotten caught in the cross-bracing of the legs below. It was wet, salty work, but once that wood dried near the stack, it burned hot. In an empty storeroom next to the bunks, I set an old steel drum on a bed of fire bricks, cut a door near the bottom, and ran a chimney pipe out through a steel plate we bolted into the outside wall. Max sealed the gaps with high-temp silicone he found and said, "Smoke goes out, heat stays in. It's ugly as hell, but it's ours." Fishing improved with more hands working the lines. I took the early shift on the lee side with a hand line over the rail while Finn checked the food inventory, and April marked water levels on each drum. Some days Mac joined me, flicking his bait out between the heavy swells without talking much. We didn't waste anything. Heads and tails went into a soup stock. Guts went back on the hook. When we brought a good haul in, April picked a corner of the deck in the wind shadow, ran lines overhead, and built a drying rack from scrap piping. The fish got cleaned, salted when we had enough to spare, and hung to dry. Gulls circled, screaming for a share, but heavy netting kept them off our winter stock. The rest of the rig turned into layers of defense. On the outer doors we didn't plan to use, we added more steel. Pipes went across the frames at shoulder and knee height, pinned with heavy bolts we scavenged from the crane base. Inside, we stacked earth-filled drums and old lockers until each unused handle sat behind a wall of dead weight. The windows in the control room got thin steel plates screwed over them, leaving only narrow horizontal gaps at eye height so a person could scan the horizon but not stick a weapon through. Only 2 outside doors stayed active. One opened onto the main deck near the stairs to the chained ladder. The other sat on the far side as a backup emergency exit. We marked the path between those doors and the bunk level with reflective tape at knee height and strips of cloth on the handrails. Power could fail at the worst time, and smoke could fill the halls. A person crawling on their knees in the dark needed to be able to follow that line blindly back to the core. Inside the core level, we made one more aggressive change. The hall that ran past the bunk room had a pinch point where the walls narrowed. Mac lagged a heavy bar of angle iron into each side and hung a grated security panel between them. Open, it sat flat against the wall, out of the way. Closed, it turned the hall into a short cage, a fatal bottleneck. He rattled the grate after we pinned the hinges and said, "If anyone gets through the outside doors, they hit this next. We stand behind it in the dark. They stand in the open with the light behind them. That's the fight I want." We worked in heavy coats and slept in layers of wool. Ice formed thick patterns on the windows, and our breath smoked in the bunk room each morning until the barrel stove caught and roared to life. We kept a simple rotating watch, one person on deck or at a window scanning the sea, one person near the core level awake, the other 2 allowed to sleep. At changeover, we said exactly what we had seen and what felt wrong. Fuel for the big generators stayed tight. Once a week, and only when the wind was howling loud enough to mask the roar of the engine, we ran one diesel unit to power the heavy tools and pump water from the lowest tanks into our drum reserve. Then we shut it down and went back to the quiet hum of the wind on the roof. The rig was never going to be comfortable. It was a collection of hard steel, sharp angles, and cold seams. But week by week, bolt by bolt, door by door, it stopped feeling like a hollow, dying shell and started feeling like something we might actually be able to hold against the world. The first time we saw another boat, the 4 of us were spread across the rig, and that separation alone made my stomach tighten. I was checking the drying lines while April was in the hygiene block. Mac was chasing a bad connection up top, and Finn was inventorying his kit. Under the quiet hum of the turbine, I heard a new sound, higher than a cargo ship and steady. It was the whine of a large outboard motor fighting the chop. I stepped to the rail and scanned the horizon until a hard-chined boat rose on a swell half a mile out. 3 people on deck, a tarp over the bow, engine pointed straight at our legs. They didn't move like refugees, they moved with a direct bearing. I hit my radio and said, "Small boat incoming from the south, positions." April answered immediately, "Going to the hall." Mac clicked twice. 2 minutes. Finn asked him high or low, and I watched the boat swing closer. High. Take the narrow window by the core gate, just eyes. By the time their hulls slid into the calmer water between the rig's legs, we were set. I lay prone behind the low wall on the upper deck with the rifle resting on the edge. Mac crouched on the grating above the main door with a heavy length of pipe. April stood back in the corridor where she could see the hinges, and Finn watched from the narrow side window near our security grate. The boat slowed as soon as they saw the modifications. One man stayed at the motor, one stood at the bow with a rope. A third sat amidship scanning the heights. They passed close enough for me to see faces through the scope. Their jackets were thick and tactical. The bowman had a pistol on his hip. The motorman kept a shotgun racked near the throttle. This wasn't a family looking for help. This was a scout team looking for a base. They circled slowly, noting the cut ladder, the fresh barricades, and the winch. When they drifted toward the leg, the bowman cupped his hands and shouted, asking if anyone was home. We stayed absolute quiet. He tried again, pitching his voice friendlier. He said they had trade goods, fuel, medicine. He said they just wanted to dock and check their prop. That was wrong all the way through. You do not yell about having valuable fuel to strangers unless you mean to take theirs. I shifted just enough to project my voice and said, "You're close enough. Kill the motor." 3 heads snapped up. The bowman squinted at the upper rail, found the rifle barrel, and slowly lowered his hands. The motorman throttled down but didn't kill it. I kept the barrel steady on the boat and said, "This rig is taken. Push on and we don't have a problem." The bowman smiled without warmth and called back, "We've all got the same problem, friend. Seas are getting worse. Places like this are rare. That's a lot of steel for one man to hold." I answered, "Doesn't matter how many of us there are. You're not coming up. Whatever you're short on, find it somewhere else." He let the rope hang loose, looking at the chained ladder, and said, "You sound sure. We've seen smaller crews take bigger platforms. Maybe we come back when it's dark and you're tired. See if you still sound that tough." Finn spoke soft over the radio. "He's testing for nerves." I let a few seconds stretch, then said, "You had your look. Now back off. The current is running south. Let it take you." He stared up one last time and said, "Storm's coming whether you like us or not. Heavy water doesn't care about your rifle. Remember that when you hear us again." That was a threat I couldn't leave hanging. I dropped the front sight to the engine cowling and fired once. The round punched through thin metal and something inside snapped with a loud crack. The outboard died instantly, smoke rolling out, and the boat began to drift back with the current away from the legs. I racked another round and said, "You come back in the dark, you don't get a warning shot. You try to climb, you don't get to climb back down." The bowman raised his hands in mock surrender and called up, "All right, you broke our motor, so I guess we row. Maybe that's what you wanted." They dug out paddles, the rowing slow and ugly against the chop. As they moved off, the bowman turned his head and shouted, "We'll see you around, Captain." Then they put their backs into it and let the current carry them into the gray. We watched until the mist swallowed them. Mac let out a breath over the radio and said, "Engine didn't deserve it, but I'd rather hit metal than bone." Finn added, "I've got enough gear for one bad day, not a siege. Let's not invite one." The wind picked up that night exactly as the stranger promised. By morning, the sky was a solid wall and the gusts made the railings hum. We tied down anything that could shift and checked the chain on the ladder twice. When the storm reached us, the rig turned into a drum. Waves hit the legs with the force of train cars, sending vibrations up through the floor. The turbine raced until Mac cut the brake. Rain found seams we had missed and ran down bulkheads in thin lines. We stayed on the core level, boots planted wide, counting the seconds each time the structure leaned. Between the roar of the wind and the thud of the water, it was easy to hear the echo of that man promising to be back, and to know that if the legs held, we wouldn't be the only ones who remembered exactly where this platform stood. The storm hammered the rig through the night and well into the next day. When the worst of the wind finally eased off, leaving a strange ringing silence in its wake, all four of us felt stiff and slow, vibrating with the ghost of the platform's motion. But the main check was simple and vital. The legs were still standing in the water. The deck was still under our boots. We could work with that. We made a careful, slow loop of the structure before we trusted anything to hold our weight. Spray had reached higher than we thought possible, leaving a crust of white salt on the windows and rails on the weather side. A small service crane near the edge had twisted on its base during a particularly bad gust and now pointed at a crooked, broken angle. 2 empty drums had broken loose from their lashings and jammed against the rail, dented but not lost. The tarp over the fish-drying rack was gone, blown halfway to the mainland. Up high, the little wind turbine Mac had built still turned, but its tail fin hung wrong, dangling by a single sheared bolt. Down by the chained ladder, the sea still heaved with a confused, angry chop, but no wave had climbed high enough to rip the landing grating away. The cable and winch that held the lower ladder section were tight, humming with tension, but not broken. Our skiff, however, was taking a beating. It slammed against the nearest leg in short, violent hits and bounced back hard on its lines. April watched it punish the fiberglass and said, "We need a second rope, a spring line, rigged as soon as the water settles, or we're going to watch our only decent boat smash itself to pieces or drift off without us." Inside, the seams had let in a little water, but nothing fatal. One corner of the galley wall showed a dark, wet streak where rain had forced its way past an old external fitting. A shallow puddle spread across the linoleum floor, reflecting the gray light. The hygiene block, our critical zone, stayed almost dry. April wiped the damp spots herself with a rag and said, "If this room fails, we fail after it. Saltwater flush, hands, soap. This is the last system that breaks, or we all go down with dysentery." Finn walked the core level with his notepad, checking for new drips, chipped paint, and loose hardware like a building inspector. When he finished, he tapped the page with his pen and said, "The steel looks fine. The people don't. If anyone starts snapping over nothing or staring at the wall instead of answering a question, say it early. Storm stress makes people make dumb choices fast." Then he shut the notebook and went to the galley to ensure everyone had eaten something warm to stop the shaking. Food stocks had taken a small hit. We lost part of a batch of drying fish when the tarp tore loose and the gulls moved in for a free meal. Our cans and dry stock in the core were still safe. April dragged every crate away from the outer walls, stacked them higher on pallets, and made a fresh inventory list with thick black lines drawn between the columns. I read down it and said we were still on the right side of the survival line if we kept pulling protein from the water, and she pointed at the lower numbers and said, "We stay that way only if the weather lets us fish. If the ocean stays angry, those cans disappear fast." We spent the first clear day after the storm in heavy repair mode. Mac managed to lock the twisted crane in place so it couldn't swing and tear something loose on the next blow. Then he harnessed up and climbed to the turbine to reset the tail. I stayed below him with a safety rope on his belt and my eyes scanning the horizon for sails or hulls. April patched the leaking seams with marine tape and sealant wherever she found water stains. Finn checked the grate at our inner gate, tightened the hinge bolts, and ran his hand along the bar like he needed to feel the solidity of the cage. That night, the platform felt smaller, closer than before. The storm had shown exactly what the rig could take before it bent. The visit from the scout boat had shown what other people were willing to try if they thought we were weak. Sleep stayed light and shallow. Every metallic clank sounded like a boot in the wrong place. Every gust of wind under the deck sounded like an engine turning over in the dark. The next morning, the radio changed tone. It wasn't the frantic shore calls anymore, but steady, clipped voices from somewhere out in the deep water. On one clear channel, a man talked about fuel runs, watch lines, and staying well clear of any harbor with smoke on the horizon. Another voice answered with weather reports and a warning about a submerged wreck near a buoy. It sounded like a loose net of working boats, trawlers, tugs, maybe a few savvy pleasure craft. Not any navy and not a real rescue team. just hard crews trading trouble so they didn't hit the same bad spot alone. We listened in shifts, huddled around the receiver. No one said our name, but more than once someone warned others to keep away from fixed platforms with unknown crews. April turned the volume down and said, "That means us. To them, we're just an unknown crew on a dead rig. Potential hostiles." Mac shrugged and said, "Unknown is fine. Known is when people start drawing lines on maps and making lists of what you have." Finn sat against the galley wall, knees pulled up, and said, "If they're calling rigs risky, they've already guessed someone like us is sitting on one of them. They know the logic." The question sat on the table without anyone turning it into a full sentence for a long time. Do we call out and join that net, or do we keep our mouths shut and let their roots bend around us? I looked at the rough map we had marked on the wall and said, "If we talk, we tell everyone in range there's a platform here with 4 warm bodies, some power, and a ladder that still works. That scout crew from yesterday might hear it. Someone louder and meaner might hear it. Once you say platform and give a grid square, you don't pull it back." April frowned at the radio, conflict in her eyes, and said, "If we stay quiet, we're betting that the 4 of us can handle anything that breaks. No trade, no backup, and no warning if something ugly starts moving our way. We're on an island." Mac ran a thumb along the table edge and said, "Trade also means answering every time someone shouts our name. It invites a crowd, and every crowd has the same problems we ran from." Finn listened to both of them and then said, "Those voices might bring a medic boat or a supply barge, sure, but they might just as easily bring 10 hungry men who want dry steel more than they want friends. We didn't vote right there. We walked another slow loop of the deck instead. The rig was still ours. 4 bunks stayed dry. The barrel stove worked, burning our driftwood stockpile. Drums held clean water. The wind line gave us light and radio without burning diesel. The ladder only reached the sea when we chose to drop it. No one was bleeding. No one was hiding a fever or a bite. Back in the galley, the air felt heavy but clear enough to make a choice. I looked at the others and said, "We call only if we're sinking or on fire. Until then, we listen and keep our name off the air. This place works because it's hard to reach and easy to miss. We don't hang a sign on it." April nodded once, accepting it, and said, "If that's the rule, we need to live like we aren't here. Light discipline. No bright lights at night, no trash thrown over the rails, and no yelling from the deck." Mac added, "If anyone does row in close again, they should see rust and nothing moving unless they press hard enough to get shot." Finn glanced at the radio and said he would keep a log of what the net said each day, tracking the movement of the fleet, and that if routes started to shift toward us, we could talk again. For now, he said, silence was the one thing that still belonged only to us. Nobody argued with that. For the rest of the day, the radio stayed on low, and we listened to the world talking to itself without saying a single word back. By the time we turned in that night, the rule was simple. Hear everything, say nothing, keep the ladder high. As long as that held, the rig stayed ours to defend or to leave behind. Winter pressed its grip harder each week. Ice glazed the rails higher every night, and some mornings the deck felt more like a frozen commercial freezer than steel over open water. The rig turned into a living map in our heads. Every clank had a known source. April could tell which pipe was groaning just by the pitch of the vibration. Mac knew exactly which hatch hinge needed grease before it seized. Finn knew our footfalls well enough that a new rhythm on the metal grating woke him faster than any digital alarm. We stopped talking about rescue. On clear days, we climbed to the roof and looked at the coast through binoculars. Smoke rose in thin black lines from places that used to be towns. No ships crossed the horizon. Out on the radio net, the working boats traded warnings and coordinates, but none of them sounded like they had space for 4 more mouths and a pile of problems. So we kept to our iron rule. Listen to everything. Say nothing. Keep the ladder high. Each day started with a walk of the deck, a hand checking the tension on the winch chain, a glance at the spring lines on the skiff, drums got checked for ice, the driftwood stove got cleaned out, and baited hooks went into the water. Inside, April kept the hygiene block running with saltwater discipline. Mac kept the battery bank steady, and Finn kept an eye on the crew instead of the steel. If someone's hands shook for no good reason, Finn noticed. When I took too many watch shifts in a row and slept too little, he sat me down in the galley and said, "You're not the only one holding this place up, Fletcher. If you burn out, you just leave more work and less time for everybody else." He was right, and I listened. My first list stayed taped to the wall by the bunks, the paper curling at the edges. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. Those 6 words became our spine. We checked them every single day. When a storm line showed on the radar, we walked the doors and bars. When the radio mentioned trouble near our stretch of coast, we stayed off the outer decks and killed the lights early. The rig is not a palace. It groans in heavy weather and leaks when the rain comes sideways. The barrel stove smokes if you feed it wet wood, but it stands far enough off the coast that no one reaches it by accident, and close enough that we can still fish and catch rain. It gives 4 people a place to work and rest without someone else's panic banging on the door at 3 in the morning. You may never stand on a platform like this. You might be in an apartment, a small house, a cabin, or a shop with the windows boarded up. The shape of the shelter doesn't matter as much as how you treat it. Pick a place you can actually hold. Learn its doors, its blind spots, and its noises, and make simple rules and write them where you can see them. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. Fix small problems before they turn into big failures. Share the work so nobody breaks trying to carry more than they should. From the water, this old rig looks dead. Just rust and sharp angles over a gray sea. If you ever pass it and notice the ladder is pulled up, the doors are barred, and a small turbine turns silently on the roof, you'll know 4 people chose to stay hidden and keep living here a little longer. If this story helped you pass some dark time, leave a like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who pays attention to exits and stairwells. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Stay warm, stay sharp, stay quiet when you need to. And when the world turns loud and stupid around you, remember, you don't have to join the crowd, you just have to find your rig and hold it.